Right. Yeah, what I wanted to mention is if we look at our reference photo before we start, some of you might have noticed that you know, the potentially that's the halfway mark. Okay, so I'm not talking necessarily here about the eye line, okay, or the horizon line. I'm just saying that the bulk of the information in this sits very central. Okay, it all sits within, if that's a top line to the information, that's the bottom line of the information. It all sits very central. And what that does is it effectively divides your format into 50-50 divide. Okay, so which we all know is a pretty boring thing to do with in any composition. Okay, and that would apply also if you divided it vertically in half. It's a no-no. It's a compositional, no-no. You just don't do it. You avoid it because there's nothing more boring than equal measurements. Now then, that doesn't mean to say that if I let me just show you this a second. If I place it there so you can see it all. So to avoid this, if you look at our photo, as I say, it effectively does that. Okay, everything, all the information is within the middle area of that. So you have a couple of options open to you. You either drop that central line. Let's refer to it as a central line for the moment instead of the eye line or the horizon line. So you drop that down to down here maybe. Okay, meaning you're creating a much larger sky area, of course, or you drop it just off halfway on here is about there. So it's really important to be mindful that your information therefore would then go in. If we chose that line there, which is below the halfway mark, all your information would drop down here somewhere like that, meaning that you're moving that down off the horizontal. I am going to have to mute actually, folks, because I can hear the tearing of masking tape and everything. You can unmute yourselves. So I hope you can see what I'm saying, what I'm sort of getting at here. So what I've done here, I've given us an imaginary sort of scene, where I'm still placing the information sort of central to the design. So there's the central line, and as you can see, I've sort of placed all the information. The tallest item, if you like, object, is this clump of trees here. Okay, and the lowest thing is down here along that line there. Now, this is really important to sort of to be aware of. If you just kept everything central here by equal measurement off that central line, you're effectively creating, that, because you're just dividing that space up equally. There's a measurement there, which is the same as this measurement here. And that measurement there is quite uniform. It's again, it's potentially boring. So this is what I mean by breaking it up or dropping the horizon line. I personally probably plumb for going lower, taking the whole line down here somewhere. So all our information sits down here. Gives us the opportunity of creating an interesting sky. Going back to our photo, okay, there's nothing here, is there? Incidentally, by the way, and I'm not criticizing your photography skills here, Chris, but there's a cast shadow over the image. That's nothing to do with the day, the atmosphere in the photo. It's actually happened by, a cast shadow falling on the scene or the photograph once it was passed on to me. So we'll ignore this dark shadow. But the point I'm making more than anything else is we have a very large area of nothingness in this sort of field. So what I'm going to do today is drop the whole thing down and give us something of a bit more of an interesting sky. Okay. Right, so I'm going to drop our line down here somewhere. And I'm just using my pencil to draw today, folks. You can, of course, use a very small, if you prefer to sort of draw this in with acrylic paint, then you know, be my guest. Just use a small brush, but I'm going to use a pencil. So there's my, I suppose we're going to have to refer to it for now as the eye line or horizon line. Now then, that gives us a good expanse of sky. And our focal point, you know, going on the grid, which is where we'd normally start, of course, we have our grid lines like this. That grid line is quite nicely placed now because it's that horizon line that I've chosen is on the grid line, which is good. Now, there's a few ways you can approach your sketch. I like to sort of go across the top of the trees, the background, and it's an approximation. What's really important if you're going to follow me with this, if you're going to do the same as me, is that the trees offer a very abstract edge, don't they? You know, I'm talking about this top edge against the sky, whereas every time it falls on the roof of a building, you get a very geometrical line there, which we'll just place out for the moment as a line, a horizontal line here. You can sort of see the reflected roof of that building, something like that, but the rest of it is in shadow. Then the trees pick up again. And I don't have to copy the tree line, but they're actually quite they're quite nicely positioned. So there's another building here, but I want to show this building, the second building, as being a little bit closer to us. It'll give our painting a little more depth. So the first one where my finger is, I'm going to suggest is pushed back a little bit into the background. Whereas this one, notice how it's slightly higher. So if I want to bring it forward, I have to make it bigger. So the horizontal line to the roof is higher than that one there. Okay. And it's bigger, of course, something like that. And again, I won't worry too much about the rest of the shape of the building because it's in shadow down here like this. And then the only tree I don't like in here is the next tree. To me, it's really odd. It's just an unfortunate coincidence that it creates a triangle, isn't it? It's a very triangular shape, something like that. And it comes directly off that angle of the roof there. Now that to me is just going to, you know, that saying, you know, you have to lie. That's what's in the photograph. That's what's there in real life. But I'm going to have to say, because I know that it'll throw the viewer's eye. The viewer's eye is going to say, that's a bit weird. We don't question it in a photograph, but we would think it was odd in a painting. You know, I won't go into why the brain thinks like that, but it's a fact. So I'm going to move the tree slightly, take the triangular shape out of it as well a bit, and give myself something like that. It must be because, you know, the reason why we have to change things to make things work is because I think when it comes to looking at a painting, we automatically go into sort of critiquing it. And if there's a bad design or something that just doesn't please the eye, the viewer is probably going to be inclined to think that the artist has got it wrong. It's quite interesting. And so, and again, this is one of the things that was meant when somebody very famous said, you know, a painting is a lie that tells the truth. Simply means that you can't always paint what you see because it will be questioned and doubted. So there's another smaller building a bit further back here. Now, again, a skyline of smaller trees here, something like that. Quite like the tree over here, right at the edge, because the one at the edge acts as a bit of a punctuation mark. So the next thing we got to consider here, of course, is the bales, the hay bales themselves. Now, the scale of them isn't enough. So here we go again, bending the rules, changing what's actually in front of us to something that will be better for the painting. So we need to increase their scale. I'm going to start with the nearest one, which I'm saying is here. There's the elliptical shape of the end of the bale. So it's not a perfect circle, okay? It might look it a little bit in the photograph, you know, the dark shadowed end of that hay bale, but it's more of an ellipse because of the weight of the mass of the straw, etc., is sort of doing more like an egg shape, if you like. Now, there's a very light top to that hay bale, catching, you know, that face there, that curvature is catching the light. So there's my first hay bale. I'm going to put one about here. I can go in close in a moment if you want to see this a little more accurately. So all these others are smaller, and they're no more than just a small elliptical shape. Let's have a couple close together. They're quite regimented in a way. I dare say if you were there in the field and you were able to walk around, these hay bales are deposited in places quite in a sort of uniform fashion. But of course, that won't make for a great painting. So I'm placing mine out in a more pleasing, interesting fashion. But what an interesting shape that is in itself. And if I were just to isolate it on a piece of paper here, hang on, let me just show you. These hay bales are no more than this. You can see that. I don't think about the bottom edge because that's a soft line at the bottom, okay? But that's what we're looking at, something like that. That's all each one of those bales offers. That's what you've got there as a shape, as the most simplified, broken down shape. So you don't have to start sort of inferring that there are, let me just get rid of the bottom of that bale a minute. So don't worry about sort of texturing, if you like, for the moment anyway, the shape of that hay bale. I'm just putting a couple over here. And what I do like is a grass. I'm going to get rid of this line now because it was my guideline. And in fact, there's no way that could be an eye line. The eye line, now that we've got the buildings in, is probably a little higher than that, about here, but it's still nowhere near the central mark. The eye line's about there, something like that. So my first line was really more of a ground line, foreground ground line. The way I see this painting going is that we'll make a little bit more of the sky, okay? But the playoff will be between the darks of the background and part of the building. They're all dark areas, and we'll have some, hopefully, quite a nice sort of summery look to the strawy coloured field, with these hay bales breaking up the pattern and the design. As I say, what I really do like, I like this idea of the edge of the field here. There seems to be some sort of ravine or grassy ditch that's giving us a line down here. And I've brought mine down a little bit lower than it really is in the photo, because we sort of want, if I brought this this grassy edge to the field as high as it is in the photo, if you look at it, it masks quite a bit of those hay bales. And I don't really want to mask those hay bales. So I'm bringing this grassy verge down about here. And that also helps in just breaking up this foreground a little bit, because as I say, if we'd have stuck to the original design with that much foreground, we'd have a large space of you know, flatness really. So there we are. There's my sort of reasoning why I've chosen to sort of draw it out this way. Okay. And now I'm just checking everything. You know, when I come to paint, I'm already thinking that you know, these sort of dark shapes of buildings, they'll be connected by the dark tone, and the dark tone needs to sit low enough to show off the tops of these some of these bales. Okay, there's no good if the tonal value behind these bales is the same light tonal value as the bales themselves, then you're not going to see the bales. So you must make sure that the tonal value comes down halfway down the bale itself. I hope that makes sense. What we're talking about here is the playoff between a light tonal value and a dark tonal value. As I say, you're playing the light of the reflected light off the bale off against the dark background that it sits in front of. And that's essential, as I said, because otherwise you will not see the hay bales. Okay. Oh, I've mentioned in the past many times, folks, and thought I'd best sort of show you what it is I use. If you work in acrylics a lot, I use a hand protector, which is like a barrier cream, and this is the one I use. It's Winsor & Newton Art Guard, okay, barrier cream. It's not very expensive. You simply little bit out, it doesn't need much. Rub it into the hands, because I've been painting in a lot of acrylics recently, because I've got this exhibition coming up in Brecon, and it's a devil to get off, particularly in between your fingernails and under your nails. It's a devil to get off, and can make your hands quite sore if you've got a lot on your hands. So this stuff is absolutely excellent. The paint comes off with just a bit of soapy water. Okay. Right. So the next thing we've got to remember here is that we're actually choosing to paint in the watercolor style, okay, which stating the obvious means we're going to use quite a bit of water. We're going to treat it as though it is watercolor to start off with, but here's the there are advantages and disadvantages, as there always is with every medium. You know, let's start with the advantage. Let's say we've just put down a watercolor type wash with these acrylic paints, okay, and to all intents and purposes it looks like a watercolor painting, and it's going to. Now then, the downside is this. You can actually repair watercolor easier than you can acrylic if something isn't quite right. So if you think watercolor's tough on you in that respect, acrylic is worse, because, as I say, you know, if your wash goes wrong with acrylic, it's no longer that effect. Now a plus, again, going back to a plus, is that okay, you can say, right, it didn't turn out the way I wanted it to, but this is acrylic, you can layer over the top, okay? And you end up moving slightly towards a less, more of an acrylic oil medium type painting than it was intended as a watercolor painting. So it's almost like it's your trump card. If anything goes wrong, the painting can change accordingly. You can start layering on and make glazes and things like this. So that in itself should make you feel quite comfortable that, you know, you can get away with probably a few mistakes, but you just have to remember that every mistake will push you further away from a watercolor type looking painting. So let's get a wash on as we would normally with watercolor. And I'm going to put out a little bit of, let me just show you, I'm going to put out a little bit of ultramarine blue. And a little bit of raw sienna. Okay, you don't need much, perhaps a little bit more than that you would if it was watercolor paint. I have an atomizer on hand. This is just a fine mist bottle sprayer. That'll keep my paints workable if I don't get, you know, if I don't use them quickly enough. Of course, some of us I know possess stay wet palettes. If you've got a stay wet palette, great. You still have to sort of spray them sometimes though, even with stay wet palettes. But this is my preferred way of painting. It suits the way I paint. So I'm starting off with a 1-inch flat. Okay. This is a synthetic fiber brush because I don't use my watercolor brushes for this. So I'm in the water. I'm just picking up. Now, I get asked this a lot. Do I pre-wet my areas before I put my washes on? Well, I don't very often. You can, it's only me. Please don't take this as, you know, the law. You can if you wish. What it does, if you pre-wet, it gives you a little bit more time to apply your wash. And I'm going to do that for those that wish to try it, or, you know, want to see the how you work when it's pre-wet. Why do we pre-wet? Why can't we just go in on dry paper? Because I've developed, I paint very quickly, so I can get paint on and water on at the same time. And for me, the reason why I choose that, the reason why I choose to work on dry, not pre-wet, is because I feel I get a little bit more texture in the pigment of the paint by going on dry paper. But I'm going to do the wet on wet. So I'm pre-wetting, just picking up water, and I'm just going to bring this down to, I think we'll bring this down to the tops of the background trees there. Okay, I'm not being too careful about whether I go over the edge into the trees. As I say, this is acrylic, and we can certainly paint over any rough edges, but I'm doing that anyway. I'm sort of thinking of it as close as I can to like a watercolor style. So there we are. If you're in a particularly dry room, a warm room, okay, you might just have to do that twice, because what happens is when you're putting water on watercolor paper like this, for the first minute or so, it sits on the surface. It doesn't actually go into the paper. Do I do the foreground at the same time? I think not. This is my decision. I think not. I think we can pre-wet it, but we'll tackle the sky first and then the foreground. Okay. So let's take a little bit of this ultramarine blue with plenty of water. Okay, so I just took a small amount of paint on the corner of the brush, made sure that paint came off the brush. You don't want it hanging around in the fibers of the brush. Break it down, okay, and then you pick up some water. That's enough to start. So when I get down to, I don't know, around here somewhere, you'll probably see me pick up some raw sienna. So in it goes. The photo gives us a very peachy, warm sky. Okay, so I'm thinking perhaps what we'll do is we'll just put a little bit of alizarin crimson in this. So I'm just letting that sit there for a moment. I just get a little bit of alizarin crimson. My top of my paint is stuck. So pair of pliers, a little bit of alizarin crimson, and that'll give us, when the two warm colors go in, that alizarin crimson and the raw sienna, we'll get that sort of peachy effect. Let's go back to the blue for a moment, just in here. And as I say, the longer I leave that, the more interest I can create in that sky. Look, the brush marks actually stay in there, aren't they? That's because I just let it dry off. I let the water go into the paper a bit more. So let's look at a little bit of warming up from the raw sienna. I am going to get rid of the blue, and the reason for that is if I put the raw sienna on the blue, of course I'll get green. I don't want a green looking sky. So a little bit of raw sienna, and that should just warm things up a tad down here. But make sure you just push up into the blue. Don't go right up here into the top of the sky, but just push into it from underneath like this. Okay. Now the little bit of alizarin crimson, I don't have to clean the palette for this. Quite weak. It's very small amounts of paint. Okay, but this will give it the peachy effect. I'm probably going to, I'm just going to take some of that now, just 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, maximum 5 brush marks there as you push those colors upwards. But you should still see a bit of coolness at the top of the sky, whilst the lower part of the sky is a lot warmer. And I'm just making good around the edges there. You can see where I've gone over the trees a little bit on my drawing. That's absolutely fine. The only thing I'd say be careful of is don't go into the tops of your barns and farm buildings back there. Stay out of those, okay? I've gone over this one ever so slightly, but that's not my main building, so I'm not too worried about that. But you can now bring, you know, some of that paint down into this area, because that's the start of your tonal value for the backs of the for the background, sorry, of the hay bales. Be very careful not to go over the hay bales. We will be going darker. This is nowhere near the finished tonal value, but it will. I always sort of use color that you see in the sky in the ground because it just keeps some cohesion. So let's paint the foreground, and my warning to you all here is, again, like I say, you can pre-wet if you wish, but I don't want you going over the hay bales. Okay, so there's that same weak wash that I just used a moment ago. I think I'm going to clean that off and just make this a lot warmer with just the raw sienna. So show you, I've just cleaned the 1-inch brush. I'm taking that, but this time I'm going to add a little bit of our other yellow, which I put on the list as, I believe, I think it was lemon yellow or any pale yellow. I've got a color here called Hansa yellow, which is very, very similar to lemon yellow. But you could also use cadmium yellow light. I'd avoid any yellow that's moving towards orange. And just put out a little bit of this. That's more than I intended. It's just that the tube decided to ooze out more paint. Okay, so this bit of yellow will bring a bit of sunlight to this foreground. Okay, in it goes, a quick mix like that. Beautiful golden color now with more water. So I'm picking up water. And where, as I say, we're going to, I mean, you could sort of make contact with the bottom of the hay bale if you like, but do make sure that that illuminated area of the hay bale is free of paint. Go over the dark end of the hay bale as well, but stay out of that section that is the reflected light on the back of the hay bale, along the spine, if you like, of the hay bale. So just carefully going around there. Now I can drag this down in a far more looser, easier fashion. I'm just going to probably just going to stick to a few vertical brush strokes here. We won't worry about the what I mentioned earlier, you know, the little ravine or wherever it is where the grass is growing. We just paint over that completely as though it's not there for now. And then I'm just tidying up anywhere I think, you know, I don't really want, in some places, a little bit of white paper glimmering through is going to be fine. But I sort of tend to get rid of any white little dots from the edges and only leave any little pockets of white paper in the interest area. Our focal point, like I say, is sort of around here. It's one of those paintings, and I think this is a really good exercise for all of us, because you know you will often be challenged by a scene where the focal point has to be slightly contrived, it has to be invented, and so a photo like this is really good for that. It forces your creative mind to work, rather than, you know, everything is given to you for you to copy. So because eventually you'll eventually have to leave that behind. If you know, as you develop as an artist, you will be required to call upon your creative side more and more. Okay, otherwise, of course, the alternative, if you don't apply creativity, if you don't find that creativity, everything you produce will be a copy of a photo or a copy of the reference that you're using. So that's why it's important to get these exercises in at every opportunity. If you can invent something that's not in the photo, invent it. Don't worry about whether it's going to work or not. I'm serious about that. You just do it, because over time and enough practice, you'll soon learn what does work and what doesn't work. But you can only learn by creating mistakes in the first place. Sometimes you get lucky and you just hit it firsthand. You know, it's just it works in the first opportunity. Okay, we're going to let this dry off a little bit, folks. And because this is a workshop, I'm probably probably just going to come over to you now and have a chat, see how you're getting on with this, because otherwise I don't want to work on this while it's still damp. That's another thing slightly different with acrylics. For some reason, they seem to sort of need a little bit more drying off time before you go back in, unless you're working wet in wet, of course, which is what we did in the sky. You know, if you think about it, we started with blue, warmed it up, then added in total 3 colors. So that was worked wet into wet. But there seems to be a slightly quicker drying time with acrylics. And so once they have dried, you actually have to leave them a bit longer than you would a watercolor, because it has to be the next thing you do on this, it becomes more of a glaze than it does a wet on dry. The difference being, of course, is that acrylic is a plastic. It's a polymer. It's a liquid polymer with pigment in it. So you've created a film. You wouldn't get that from watercolor. Watercolor remains a matte, porous surface. But the more acrylic you put on a surface, the more you close that surface down and seal it. So it's almost like painting on plastic with consecutive washes and colors, rather than painting on a porous paper surface, as you would with watercolor. So the first change for this stage is to go down a size in brush. So I'm going down to a 1/2 inch flat, okay? Again, for those of you that want to know this particular brand, had this years. I don't, it's okay, you know, it's not a bad brush. It's made by Dale Rowney and it's the Graduate series. But that, trust me, you can get this one, sorry, 1/2 inch flat in most manufacturers, in Pro Art. We mentioned rosemary brushes. So this will just give us a little, just a little more dexterity, if you like, around our shapes. So is my paint still alive? I think it is, because I've sprayed it. And we're just going to, we obviously need to make a green, don't we? I mean, it's a dark green for the background. So I'm starting with the trees in the background, okay, as you see me go around our buildings. But if you look at that photo, really, the darkness of the buildings, okay, it's very, very difficult to differentiate between the darkness of the trees. I'm talking color here. The tone is obvious, it's very dark. But in terms of color of that dark, it's very hard to tell the difference between what's the tree behind and the actual building in shadow. But that's really the limitations of a photograph again. So what I'll probably do, and I'll explain as I'm doing it, I'll go for mostly a dark green in the trees, but when I get into the dark of the buildings, I'll probably introduce a little bit more warmth, you know, from the burnt sienna, sorry, from the raw sienna and alizarin crimson. So let's see how it goes. I almost want to deliberately make a mistake, you know, so you can see how we would fix it. So as I said, that shouldn't be too difficult. So let's start off with a green. That's ultramarine blue. And we'll go for a direct green. We'll go for the yellow for the moment, the lemony yellow type color. That's going to dry off very quickly, that, okay? So this is what I'm going to do. I'm just going to spray it slightly. So I've got a lot more moisture there in the mixing area. So that's a dark, cool green. Do want to make quite a bit of it, but I'm going to warm it up slightly with some raw sienna, more blue, and I'll keep going back and forth here until I get what I want. Volume is one thing, I need a lot of it. Back to that yellow. Now, if I wanted to make this dark green even darker, my choice of color to add to it would be the alizarin crimson, because when you're using opposites, green and red are opposites, as soon as the opposite goes in, it goes darker. Just to prove the point, take a little bit of alizarin crimson, and this will go even darker, okay? Right, okay. That's a good starting point there. Fully load the brush. It's really important to load the brush correctly. So I turn it over like this, making sure that you know, that the paint loading is not in one area of the brush only. It's evenly distributed throughout the fibers of the brush. Okay, and I'm right-handed, so I'm going to work from left to right, so I'm not smudging anything as I go. And count your brush strokes. I don't mean, you know, I don't mean sort of, perhaps I should say be conscious of how many brush strokes you're applying. I don't want you to say 1, 2, 3, 5. You'll forget what it is you're supposed to be doing. But the point I'm trying to make here is be economical. You don't want lots and lots of brush strokes. So if you want to suggest further little, further smaller hay bales in the background, leave those little spots at that level there above ground, and the brain will fill the rest in. The brain will say, oh, they must be more hay bales. I'm just going up. I'm coming up to my first little building here now. I've got a feeling that this building, it's difficult to tell, but I've got a feeling that this building's actually got a chimney on it on the one end. I'm going to ignore that. I don't see that as playing an important part. But you do want the angle of the roof just there, like that, okay? And here we go again. We're going through here. There's a hay bale, but there, my first hay bale. Come down a little bit in places. As I say, the idea is that you create smaller little glimmers of light in the painted areas that can be other things, further hay bales or smaller buildings or whatever. Now I'm working, I could come across in front of this to do the front face, the front elevation of this barn, okay, about there. But I feel as though that should be warmed up slightly just to make it look a little different to the background. So I'll just take a small amount of the warmer colors. That's the raw sienna and the alizarin crimson, okay? And that can go into that side of that building just to show it off as looking a little bit different. And then it will have, even though we can't see the shape because the tonal value makes the shape of the building disappear into the background, we still need to show off that angle there, that leading edge on this right-hand side of the roof. And then we're back into picking up the dark green because immediately behind that, of course, is a tree. Now the photo shows trees with sky gaps, you know, gaps between the upper branches in some of these trees. That's entirely your choice. If they occur in my paintings, it's more out of incidental, accidental, if you like, brushwork that allows for that to give that appearance. I'm not going to go looking to paint perfect little trees in the background that have, unless I get to my focal point, which I'm about to approach now, and maybe this tree here, perhaps we could do a little more finesse on this tree. Notice how I always take a little bit of the background tree over the corner of the top of the roof. Because the brain, for some very strange reason, will not do that. It wants to sort of stop, like the tree is part of the building. The tree isn't part of the building. It lives beyond the building itself, the edge of the building. So try and remember to go slightly over the corner. Again, I'm going to warm that up a little bit, this front edge. So I just make a little mini mix on the side of my palette here, just to warm that up. And I've got this again. So I was saying about perhaps this tree here. Now this is, let me just concentrate a little bit here. This is my main hay bale, the one that's closest to us. So I'm going to go around this quite carefully here. Now with a little finger or a credit card, why don't we scrape out a little sort of window in that front wall, okay? Just scraped out a little window in the front wall of our building. And this is where I'm thinking about taking a rigger brush. Now, my room's not very warm. It's not overly warm, let me put it that way. So this is already drying out a little. So I'm just going to spritz my paint, and take the rigger brush. And this is the only tree, a little bit off there. This is the only tree really that I'm going to break up. And I'm dancing over this surface like this to show that this tree has some space and some air about it. Okay, and I'll even though it's not showing in the photo, I'll even give a little white edge before it makes, rather than make contact like here. I lost the edge of that building in the background, but for this one here, down the slope of that roof at the back there, I just want to leave a little gap, a little more random around the edge. You know, you've got to make a random edge to these trees. Now that I've seen a little bit of that on this one, this side of that tree probably needs to copy it a little bit. Now, at ground level, it's that things get a bit easier again. So I'll go up to this roof, my next roof. There's still the tops of these hay bales down here. So it's just a little bit of, got to give some careful thought to, you know, the edge of the paintbrush. You need to know where the corner of that brush is all the time. Otherwise, you're going to lose things. You're going to lose the tops of your hay bales, or not show them off, not make the right edge. There's the leading edge to that little building. I want to warm it up again. So I'm just taking the alizarin and the raw sienna again in at the edge of this dark green puddle. That makes it a warmer dark green puddle. And a little bit of warmth in the background as well here. And here. And a little bit of warmth in that tree that we made a moment ago, just to give it some form. Now I'm adding water to this because really what I've done here is I've completed the tricky area. That's the focal point territory. Just making the top of that hay bale a little neater with the rigger brush, a little bit fiddly. And down at ground level, if you want, you could run a couple of horizontal lines as though there's a fence back there. I'm using the rigger brush for this again. Through here. Let's continue in a right direction. And then we'll go completely over this little building. There are gaps over the tops of the others. Might leave a little slither of light on that back sloping roof for this one. Round the hay bales. Let's go a little bit more green again. So I'm just mixing up some fresh green. That's the ultramarine blue and lemon. So I want to get back to that green effect, because really all we're dealing with from here on in is the trees in the background. Now I quite like smudging with my finger sometimes. Just gives a little texture. And now I see these greens is looking a bit flat, some of them over here. So I'll take a little bit of the lemon yellow and just pop that in one or two places. Careful not to overwork. And that's me saying that to myself. Now, what about the height of your trees? Have you checked that out? Have you made sure that the height of your trees don't always all go up to the same height? Okay, look how they meander in terms of height. Okay, there's no two clusters the same, really. Okay, so we've got the basics there of what we want. Let's find that a little bit too busy now, this tree over here. I always plumb for things that are slightly more geometrical in shape. If you look at the trees in the photo, some of them are quite pom-pom-like, quite rounded. I don't feel that this is just a personal thing. I don't feel as though that offers much in terms of dynamic. So I prefer to keep my trees mostly slightly more geometrical, I should say. Okay. That is to say, they've got squared off edges in places. What else can we do here? We could take the scraping card, okay, if you want. Don't go mad with this because there isn't much evidence of it in the photograph, you know, but then that is the photograph. So you could just scrape out the odd tree trunk if it's right. Still too wet, isn't it, for me to do that, but here and there. Now there's a telegraph post, I believe, right here. In the photograph, of course, this building is a little more central, only by 3/4 of an inch or so, but it's a little more central. Okay, so I've got to try and sort of make I've got to steer away back from the center a little bit, okay, to this direction here. So what I'm going to do is use a vertical, because everything's horizontal. I'm going to use this card to give me a telegraph post, okay, but it's not going to go where it is in the photo, because that again would be too close to the center. I'm going to take it right to the edge of the building and just load up the edge of this card here like this. So you can see the edge of that card's got paint on it, and that's going to be my, might be too much on it. I'm just going to touch down that edge of card onto a piece of paper for a minute, because I think there's too much paint on there. Now I should be able to put it in. There we are. There's a perfect line just from the edge of the credit card. Again, it's time for some creativity, okay, because there's not much on offer as it stands at the moment, which again this is why I favor photographs like this. If it was full of information, you'd really be struggling to as to what to leave in, what to include, what to leave out rather. So this gives you plenty of room for ad lib. So we'll have another smaller, we'll have another telegraph post here. But I think I'm going to put a telegraph post a little bit closer to us. Therefore, and by that I mean it's going to be taller, and it's going to be about here. Okay, there we are. There's a telegraph post that's coming towards us. But look, it wasn't put in that position, you know, randomly without thought. It's on the grid line, isn't it, more or less? So if we did have our grid in place, look at where that telegraph post falls. It's almost directly on, if not directly on, the left-hand vertical grid line. Okay, right. I think we've got to let that dry off a little bit, though it might be an idea to put the shadowed sides of our hay bales in while we're at it. And in fact, yeah, shadowed side of our hay bales and the grassy ravine as well. Now, what I'm going to draw your attention to before I do it is this. We're going to leave little slithers of light around the edges of things. I'll just show you, I'll demonstrate exactly what I mean here. I'm using the warmer mix. That's the raw sienna. Let's take a little bit of burnt sienna for this, okay? Because that's even warmer again. And as these hay bales are closer to us than the buildings, then we'd expect the warmth to increase. So I'm just putting out a little bit of burnt sienna, not much. And into that I can use this green puddle with more blue. So we've got a nice dark warm color there. could put a little bit of alizarin crimson in there, giving us a sort of burnt orange type color. And we'll start with the main one here, which is quite thick paint. And I've just shaped, and this is what I mean. Let me just home in on this, going close, because I want to show you exactly what I'm doing here. What I'm talking about here is leaving a little slither of light around the curvature of the hay bale on the far side. Okay, but don't, whatever you do, don't make it a clean edge at the bottom. It's obscured by the grasses in front of it, remember, okay? So a nice rough broken edge here. Now the other hay bales, just no more than a little nick of the brush, little just touch down here. And even if you haven't created a hay bale by leaving out white, the white shape, you can still infer that there's one just by giving it a dark edge like that somewhere. There's additional hay bales like there, or back there somewhere. Okay. Now then, the what you're about to see now is very much, as much perhaps, as a watercolor technique that I'm going to show you. And that is, we're going to do this grassy ravine, okay, here, but we're going to use the belly of the brush, and that's what I mean by it being a as much a watercolor technique as an acrylic painting technique. So I'm loading the 6 round brush, the size 6 round brush, okay, and I'm using the belly of the brush. The grasses in the photo seem to be falling like this. If you look at them, there's definitely a nap, if you like, to the grass. The growth of the grass is, I'm not sure how important that is, but it probably is important. Otherwise, I wouldn't have noticed it. I think, therefore, so it's funny. These are the subtle things that you need to be sensitive to. They sort of go, it's like a wave going that way. And I'm wondering whether, because we've got the hay bales giving us a movement message from left to right, those hay bales are definitely giving us a message of movement, and that is a left to right movement. Whereas the grasses, if they sweep this way, that's gonna look awkward, I think, potentially. So we either go with the left to right nap in the grasses, or we keep them vertical, and the vertical would be a neutral, so it would work. I'm going to try just going with the left to right sweep there, so opposite to what's actually in the photo. Okay, leave gaps, make sure to leave gaps, don't just go across your piece of paper filling this in like it's a wall. It's not, you know, these things grow randomly. Broken areas. My own palette is getting in the way there, so, and I'll even bring them down, because I think it'd be better if we made this grassy edge look a little bit closer to us. Run out of paint. It's good though, when your brush is running out of paint, you get the best you know, hit and miss delivery. You get that real textural delivery of paint. So don't just automatically reload the brush just because it's showing signs of running out of paint. Now, it's all one color, isn't it? So I'm dunking my brush in water, and I'm picking up something warmer, raw sienna, not burnt sienna, raw sienna. Let's get you back in focus. So I've just warmed up these grasses, and I've just gone along like this with the belly of the brush, okay? Now there's another way of doing that. You could just use a single brush stroke. You could load up, you know, a big 1-inch brush there like this. You could go through here at this, something like that. And then, of course, you could scrape out you could scrape out all those little areas that I've just been creating by using the belly of the round brush. So it's your shout. You know, there's always more than one way of doing these things. And I think we're going to take a break here, folks. You know, a coffee break, tea break, whatever. So I want to show you in the next stage what color. Obviously, what the you know, we need to apply a color to the tops of the bales because it doesn't look great with white. This is perhaps a bit of a difference too between the watercolor and acrylic. The white bare paper doesn't work that well with acrylics, I find. So we will choose a color, a nice warm color for the roofs, and I want to show you how to glaze over the foreground, okay, when we get back, and that'll be good timing because it'll give that initial wash good length of time to dry off, because you don't want to be glazing on damp, anything that's still damp. So I'm going to come back over to you before I take a break, see how you're getting on. I'm picking up clean water, cleanish water, and that's probably can't see that, but you have to trust me on this. I'm putting water in this, and I'm going to take some raw sienna, and we're just creating a glaze, okay? A little bit more. Don't want it too strong. You can always strengthen it, remember, okay? You're better off going too weak than too strong with this. And make sure there's none of those nasty pigments stuck in the fibers of the brush. This is really quite easy, but what I want you to do is stay off the top of the field. By the top of the field, I mean perhaps the width of a brush handle here, you know. So this glaze is going to be applied from about here downwards. But we're also going to go over the tops of the roofs of the buildings and the bales of hay themselves. So actually, let's start up here. Go over the tops of those buildings. Just a very gentle. This is one of the great things about acrylic. Unlike watercolor now, you don't have to worry about moving color that was already underneath, unless it's still wet, of course, and it might have been there. Look on that little building with mine. I think there was a little glimmer of wet acrylic paint somewhere around there, but you know, no biggie. It does normally dry off really quickly, so just check your painting for any little pockets of still wet acrylic paint, or speed dry it. But then the gentlest of brush strokes over the hay bales like this. That's the very top of a hay bale. You could leave a little bit white. If there's anything I miss or accidentally do when I'm doing this, there's always the option to pick up a little bit of a mix of paint with a bit of white in it and put those highlights back. So as I said, stay off the top of the field, but if you can see here, this is where I'm going to add the glaze from here down. Okay, I'm running out of paint, reload, pick up where I left off, run to here. So only the top of the field now has got the original coat of paint, if you like. Now that's quite a hard line. It might look subtle at the moment, but trust me, as it dries out, it'll look harder and harder. So I just affect it by touching it with my finger, and I'm talking about the top edge of that glaze that I just made. Now I'll get down to here. I could leave, I'm hoping I might leave just a couple of glimmers of the pale initial wash in places, you know, sort of here, little buildup of paint in places. There's a bead there, help that down through the foreground. And now what I'll do in here while it's still wet, this is very much like watercolor. I'll pick up a little bit of the ultramarine blue, just a small amount of ultramarine blue. Find somewhere on your palette where you can just get it onto the brush like that. It's okay if you make contact with the yellow puddle that's in your palette, that's okay. But that little bit of blue there now, if I take the blade of the brush like this, okay, and just run through the immediate foreground a few times here like this. This is wet in wet, just like we would if we were painting in watercolor, of course. And that those little streaks, those weak streaks of ultramarine blue, just give a little bit of form to the foreground. I like to sort of bring it right down to the bottom, actually, usually. So just cool off that immediate bottom area like that. And what that little bit of cool does, it makes the warm look even warmer. Okay. Now you might need a little bit of this in the grasses, not too much. But I'm going to have a little bit of fun with this grassy area now. I'm going to put a bit more color into it because it's gone. My grasses there have gone very grey. Okay, from just demonstrating what I was doing and the different methods. So I'm going to pick up a bit of the bright yellow, the lemon yellow, a little bit of the blue, make a green again. I want a fair bit of yellow in this. I don't want too much blue in it. And I'm just going to spice up a couple of areas in the grasses here with that green, just hit and miss here and there. Just adds a slightly nicer color to the whole painting. Okay. Can go into the background in some of those trees with the same color. You don't want too much back there because saturated color like this, which it is, you know, doesn't show up that much at distance. So only put a tiny bit of this color in the background. Okay. Now I'm going to clean this palette off because what I'm going to do next is not going to be easy to achieve with all that water in the mix. So there it goes. So that was a glaze. Other than what I did in the grasses, that little bit of extra green, that initial wash is a glaze. And a glaze, of course, as it suggests, is just a thin wash of color that sits on top of the other colors. Excuse me. And glazes can be really, really useful with acrylics because if you go too bright, for instance, in an area, imagine if we'd used too much of the lemon yellow in that foreground and thought, you know, it's just too artificial looking, then you'd mix up probably the same colors we just used, the raw sienna, into a glaze as we just did, and you would tame that bright yellow back, okay, to something more realistic, something more acceptable. So that glazes are very, very useful. You can use glazes in watercolor, but the thing is, in watercolor, you really have to make sure that it's a long process. If you're using multiple glazes in watercolor, you have to make sure that each glaze is dried out, and I mean really dried out, up to 24 hours between each glaze, or you can speed dry it. But with speed drying, you're never guaranteed that it's fully dry. I used to follow an American artist. Her name was, Catherine. Don't quote me on this. At least one part of this name is correct. I think she was Catherine Henderson. Anyway, she's a watercolorist that works by using glazes. She produces beautiful work. I must check her out again, actually, because I haven't checked this artist out for some time now. I'm going back, 8 years ago, possibly. If that name's wrong, drop me an email. I'll find it again and I'll let you know who it is I'm talking about. But she would use multiple, up to 20 to 30, sometimes more glazes in her watercolors. And the effects were beautiful. But as she quite clearly states in her demonstrations, it's a long process. Some of her paintings can take a month, just one watercolor painting to take a month. Me, it didn't work for me. As soon as I started favoring working quickly, I stopped following her. But she's, for anybody interested, she's definitely worth checking out. So, okay, folks, what I'm going to do now is check for any sort of little pockets of still wet paint. So I'm just taking a tissue and knocking them out a little bit there. And I think it would be good if we gave a little bit of special spice color to perhaps our nearer hay bale. So I've got the size 6 round brush in my hand, and to get an orangey color, we can use a bit of alizarin crimson. Could use just orange, of course. If you want to invest in a tube of cadmium orange, that would be the shortcut. But I like to show people how to mix colors as well. So that was a bit of alizarin crimson. Into that, I put a little bit of raw sienna. Okay. Again, you have other options. You could use burnt sienna. Okay. Be careful with the yellow. The obvious one might be the yellow. You think red and yellow will make an orange, but be careful with a opaque yellow, because it will actually dull it down a bit. Okay, right. So here goes. I'm just going to put a small amount of that orangey color into that. Just going to take a little bit of raw sienna on its own. Look, I keep that separate over here in a separate puddle. And into that, I'll just add that here, because I'm mixing on the paper. That gives you a warmer looking hay bale there. So the others now will need a much weaker version of that. So I put a lot of water into the edge of this puddle that I made, this color, and we'll just hit one or two of the others that are close-ish. Okay. So we're inventing where, you know, this is us making these decisions, not the photograph. It's nothing to do with the photograph. This is us making the art. So I'm just playing around with that color a little bit. Don't want to fiddle with it too much. I'm going to spatter a little bit too. So a little bit of the same color. The color I just used in this hay bale, I'll spatter into the foreground. And now I'm probably going to lift a little bit off the top. I've squeezed this brush out, this little brush that I've been using. I've squeezed all the paint and water out of it over the water tub, okay? It's now a thirsty brush. And I'm going to put back the highlight at the top of that hay bale just by running a thirsty brush over the top there. Look at that. It really gives the hay bale a sense of 3 dimension when you remove the paint to reveal the light. And if your paint seeps back in to where you just took it out from, so it's a bit like digging a hole in a muddy field when it's still raining. It'll quickly fill up again. So what you do is you do it a second time, like this. Repeat the process. Take everything, even though you thought it was only a small amount of paint and water you just took off, get rid of it. Clean the brush again, and do that process again until that top of that hay bale stays pale. Okay. There we are. If you've got to do it a third time, you've got to do it a third time, but it's well worth it. It really gives a sense of form to your objects. Does this roof need a little bit of that color? Be a little bit careful. The near end here, one swipe of the brush like that gives a little bit of texture. Very subtle. Don't even know whether you picked that up on this. I think you should. I'm looking at my monitor screen. Yeah, I think you just see that just about registers that little hit of on the near end of this roof. I just ran the same color down here. Okay. Now I'm looking to pick up the rigger brush and get some white on the go. So let's put some white. If I dare put that on my painting and not spoil it. So I'm just picking up a bit of white paint. I'm just taking a little bit of white paint here. Don't want too much. Just going to roll the rigger brush. So the rigger brush with lots of water in it, like this. Roll the fibers of the rigger brush around. If I put it over that dark bit of paint, you can see what I've done there. I've just loaded 2/3 of that brush. I'll do it again. Make sure there's plenty of water in the rigger brush and you're rolling it around like this. There it is. So a little bit of white spatter here. It's summer, remember, and you can imagine somewhere like a hayfield in all that dry, strawy environment with all the straw hanging around. There's all sorts of airborne particles. And I'll also use this to suggest in front of some of these buildings, a little fence. If you're putting in a fence, whatever you do, don't put in horizontals and verticals in equal amounts. Most of my fences, if you think about it, the only reason why you see a fence at distance, that's a railed fence, a piece of wood horizontal, is you only see the horizontals. Okay, so you only see the horizontal part of the fence. That's simply because anything vertical is not reflecting the light, okay, unless the light is low in the sky. So the only thing you should concern yourself with to create a fence is the horizontal, because it's only the tops of horizontals that pick up the light. All about light. Painting, when you get to this stage, it becomes all about the light direction. It's really mostly above us. If you look at the photo, there's not much evidence of shadows traveling. Now, sorry, there's not much evidence of shadows running across the floor of the ground, is there? So that suggests that the light is more or less straight overhead. Okay, it could be behind us, and the shadows could be behind the hay bales. That's a possibility, and that would explain why the roofs of the buildings are illuminated with light. So it could be behind us, but it's certainly not from the side, because we would see, if it was, we would see the shadows running along the ground. Now, so yeah, so there's no shadows per se. Having said that, I like shadows because you look at these poor little isolated shapes, okay? There's nothing connecting them. So in a moment, when I'm done with this white and the rigger brush and the white, in a moment, I think it would be a good idea to suggest the light is actually coming from the left over here. That would mean that would still be okay for the illuminated roofs. But it will allow us to join some of these hay bales together. I'll show you what I mean in a moment. Let me just enjoy a little bit more work with the white paint. So I'll continue the bottom of the telegraph post to go into the dark with the white paint. There might be cables going towards it. There might be a few other vertical bits and pieces around the scene. This is very, this is very intuitive. It's just suggesting things. When you get a strong horizontal, as we have in a typical landscape, okay, the landscape, the story of this image is screaming out for something opposite. So that's why we choose to put in telegraph posts, because they're the little bit of vertical against all that horizontal. So I'm going to put some cables and I'm picking up here ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, okay, but because I don't want these cables to look too hard, that would look really artificial. If I use this dark mix that I've just created now on here, that would look too hard. In watercolor, you just use water to thin it down, but I'm going to use a little bit of white into that. I've created a gray. That's too pale now, so I've got to go back the other way a little bit. Both colors in there again. That's it. So I've got a sort of purpley gray color there, okay, a warm gray. Now then, if you're not confident doing freehand cables like this, I'm going to show you how to do it. You could use the edge of the card, you could just sort of take the edge of the card, if you can get flat enough to that surface of the paint, and use that. That works okay. But you know, I must. I'd be a rubbish tutor if I didn't show you how to do it freehand. So you go in, you hold your rigger brush as though it's an extension of your index finger like this, okay? And when you're ready, you go in close, you hold your breath for a couple of seconds. And when you're ready, and look at, I just hover off the surface by about somewhere between 1 inch and 3/4 of an inch. When I'm ready, I hold my breath. Everything locks up on the body except the fingers here, except the hand. And you just go in. And I can't talk. There's no way I could talk while I'm doing that because it would go everywhere. So just to show you again over here, I've got to be really careful with this one because it's so far away. We probably wouldn't see the cables, but I'll show you anyway. So you go in close, and when you're ready, hold your breath. And just move as little of your arm as possible. Okay. Now, there are further embellishments you can make. It's really up to you now. This is, none of this is according to any rule. Rules are out the window. Creativity and imagination take over. So I mentioned the lines of shadow between the bales using the same color. Okay, as I say, if I had to describe this color, it's only the really the three colors. That's ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and a little bit of white. You could add a little bit of alizarin crimson if you want to take it more plummy in color, because that shadow color is going to be a warmish plummy color. Now, let's say then that the light is coming from the left, and where you've got a couple of hay bales that are close-ish together, you can run those shadows as though they make contact. The hay bales are making contact with each other, like as I'm doing here. That was a bit heavy-handed, but that's because I'm talking while I'm doing it. So that one there, but it's great. Really does sew everything together. You know, it really does combine. I will go in close. So you'll have to remind me to zoom back out afterwards. But you'll see what I mean when you take a shadow across the ground like this. One object, hay bale, makes contact with the next hay bale, and that, as I say, really helps to put form again on the scene. And we're really not far off the finish here, folks. What about some extra, the 1 or 2 extra grasses, if you like, okay, or the flower heads of something wild growing out of the foreground here. Tap a little bit of that dark mix again around here. And we're really there. Is there anything else I could add to this? Not really. I think that suffices. You know, it's. So let me just evaluate this now, as though you folks weren't there and I wasn't teaching. Okay, this is really me now, and I want you to so you can see how exactly, truthfully see how I evaluate my painting, my work at this stage, at the end. First of all, I will look at the whole. You know, I stop looking at the miniature. I stop looking at the little post. I stop looking at each hay bale. I just want to know whether the whole scene is working as a unit. And the best way to do that, the easiest way to do that, of course, is to isolate it with a mount. So by putting the mount around my painting, it just allows you to see it better. Okay, I suppose edges are very distracting, so this gets rid of the edge. So let's look at the major things we need to consider when we're producing a painting, a balanced painting. Light and dark, dynamics. Well, we've got that. We've got a nice light pale sky, pale foreground. And the paleness of the background, the sky, and the foreground sandwiches all the other tonal values, doesn't it? It really squeezes them into this area here. So I'm happy with the tonal exchanges. I'm happy with the color temperatures. I feel as though my dark greens over here are dark, and they're not warm greens, okay? You can't use warm greens against warmer foregrounds. They have to be cool greens because they're in the distance. Information, is it entertaining enough? You know, I think so, because I've really, if you look at this, if you keep looking at this, you keep going around it, but you're always, I hope, going to settle around here, aren't you? Because one, it's the biggest building, and it's the biggest area of light against the biggest area of dark off this roof. This hay bale also sort of comes in our direction, so it's keeping you here rather than going off over there or going off over there. Whoops. The vertical, the tallest thing on the painting is in the right place. It's here in the focal point area, which further helps to nail the focal point. It's the only vertical, it's the only real vertical in the whole of the design. So yeah, I'm happy with that. I think the tonal exchange, I think the texture, the foregrounds that can be deceptively difficult. Okay, here's the rule of thumb about foregrounds. They must be neither too busy nor too bland. Okay, and I'm sorry that that sounds like such a generalization, but it's true. If you think of, there's quite a bit of texture here, right, around this area here, created through the trees in the background and the hay bales, little inferences of fences in front of the buildings. Quite a bit of busyness and texture there. Now, if you went really busy in your foreground, you're not going to want to look at that painting because it's overload. It's visual overload that the eye does not get. You just won't want to look at it. Okay, so you have to. You have to keep certain things for certain areas in your painting. So the foreground, just we've got a little gap in the foreground, by the way, and that's not by any sort of accidental idea. That's a way of letting you get through here. Walk up to the edge here. You can walk into that field. Always put yourself in the position of a real person looking at this scene. You're actually there. Okay. Trust me, if you went through here with a brick wall that had no gap in it, that painting, no matter how good the painting is behind that wall, how well you've painted it behind that wall, your viewer is going to be, I can't access this painting. There's a big message saying stone wall, stay out. Okay, so gaps, that's why gaps in the foreground are really important. But it's understated and it's not overstated. So beware of over texturizing your foreground. Always allow for a way through. If you're using something like this, had we have just stuck closer to the original photo, I mean, look at the photo, that grassy verge or that ravine, whatever it is, it's the edge, the grassy edge there is much higher up in the mix. It hides some of the hay bales. Well, I felt the need to show it separately because that gave us a little bit more dynamic behind with that. That was a personal thing. I would maybe be tempted to do another version and take it up, but I'm pretty certain I would come back to this version of dropping that down slightly lower than it is in the photograph. So what else is there to consider? The overall works, so that the overall unit works, it's cohesive. And then it's the detail. Finally, it's the detail, and I think it's okay. Is the end of this hay bale here? It's getting my attention for some reason. Don't always know why, but it is. So I have to think about it. And why am I looking at that and wondering whether it's right or not? Could be because it's a little bit flat. So I take a little bit of white and a little bit of burnt sienna, okay, a little bit of that dirt that we used on the shadow, and just touch in a little bit of opaque, because there was white in this mix, remember, and take a little bit of opaque to that, subtle as it might be, okay, and I will move in close in a moment, subtle as that might be, it just helps to take the flatness out of that, the end of that hay bale. Right, let me just home in then and show you this up close. So I'm just moving this around a little bit so you can see it, a slightly better version of it, okay? But look at how, you know, the play of water in acrylic paints can be really useful. And I think it's a better effect in some respects than it is in watercolor, unless, you know, when I say painting in acrylics helps you understand watercolor better, look how much paint you have to use to get that effect of having water play its part in the paint when it's on the surface. Now, it's easier to spot when you're that particular issue is easier to spot when you're working in acrylics, but it's what you should be doing with your watercolors as well, using more paint. Don't be mean with the paint. That's the way you get lift outs and textural shapes. You don't really do it other than the odd touch of a brush in those areas, but it gives depth. So yeah, so over on the left there's not much out on the peripheral here. Over on the right, there's not much to write home about over here. It's all played down. It's all, you know, much, it's subdued over here. It's always about the focal point territory like this here, okay?